Says, hello, podcast hosts. I thoroughly enjoy the podcast, the app, and all the content you create on your blog and the YouTube channel. You got me properly stuck into the TR ecosystem, and I'm getting faster than I've ever been. Good to hear, Seamus. Good to have you with us. You go to TrainerRoad.com and sign up like Seamus did. He says, I have a question that came up after recent discussions on increasing carbohydrate intake. Having a close friend who is a diabetic, I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that I don't understand the sugar and insulin relationship that our bodies have. Does insulin spike every time we eat sugar? Isn't that bad? And if so, are we risking becoming diabetics by upping our carb intake on the bike through pure sugar water? I've never felt truly comfortable with asking these questions, as it seems a simple thing that most people understand that I simply do not. But perhaps I could take advantage of this safe place to ask such questions. Many thanks in advance from Seamus. And Chad, that's kind of one of the reasons that we're here, right? On that last part.
Mm-hmm. I like that we're perceived as a safe place to ask tough questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. So Chad, where do you want to start?
Okay. So first, I guess a bit of housekeeping. Let me just before we get to the discussion or answer the actual question, let's just keep it super general and say that anything regarding the human body is rarely simple. So first off, Seamus, you need not be embarrassed for asking. And this holds especially true for nutrition. It's an ever complex, increasingly so. As you learn more, you realize you know less than you thought you did. And it's just a tough matter. Very expansive topic. Additionally, if you're wondering, it's been my experience that we're seldom alone in our ignorance. I mean, I think back to early days of college where I'm in a lecture class of 150 students and I have a question, but I don't dare ask it because I think, everyone's going to think I'm an idiot because they all know the answer, but I'm somehow the one person who doesn't. And it just doesn't carry. And inevitably someone asks that question and there I am sitting there going, oh, good. Someone else wondered. And I promise you, I'm not the only one relieved by someone else having asked that question. Okay. Secondly, and this will be a bit of a recurring theme over the course of this discussion. I may not say it explicitly at times, but the idea that endurance athletes are in fact a different class of human. The stressors that we subject ourselves to bring about all sorts of changes in, physiologically, obviously, but psychologically, but biologically, it all ties together. But the fact is, what applies to sedentary, normal folk, untrained, or people who've never trained, will never train, doesn't carry directly across to people who, basically take care of themselves, challenge themselves. Okay, so now back to the actual topic. Let's begin by discussing the mechanism of insulin, because as you've admitted, Seamus, you don't understand this, and you assume that people do, and I promise you they don't, because the more I dug into this, the more I recognized that what I thought I knew was, again, just a glaring example of how little I actually know. So for the sake of this discussion, we're going to kind of reduce insulin to a storage hormone. But with that said, I want to point out what Jake Kushner, who's a medical doctor, he is a pediatric endocrinologist who's worked for quite a long time with children and adults in relating to type 1 diabetes. He also knows quite a lot about type 2 diabetes as a result of that, of course, and just metabolic disorder in general. And I'll summarize, but he basically says that insulin regulates every cell in the body. It basically decides if a cell is in feast or a famine state. It decides, well, are we going to park nutrients in the cell, which is the storage I just referred to, or are we going to mobilize them for energy? So it's effectively the master regulator of cell nutrients. Okay. So as long as we're clear on that, it's really easy to move forward and understand the importance and the impact of insulin. So 10,000 foot view, the pancreas, organ in our abdomens, responds to hyperglycemia, basically elevated blood sugar. And in doing so, it releases insulin, and this hormone actually serves to promote glucose uptake. So whether it comes from carbohydrate that you just ate, or glycogen that you ate, or glycogen that's broken down from your stomach, or I'm really blowing it, your liver or your muscles. So glycogen breakdown or carbohydrate, either way, it's going to get reduced to glucose. And this is the principal stimulus for insulin secretion. Now, couple that with glucagon, and I'm not going to go that direction because I think it muddies the waters, what we're talking about today, but that's the other side of things. Whereas insulin is responsible for the uptake of glucose out of the bloodstream, glucagon is responsible for the release of glucose into the bloodstream. And these two hormones basically form the basis for blood sugar regulation. but we're just going to focus on insulin. So while hyperglycemia, or an increase in the sugar in your blood, basically carbohydrate, is the trigger for insulin release, we also see stimulation of insulin release due to amino acids and fatty acids. So the point is simple, just all macronutrients impact our insulin activity. Now, on the outside of the cells, we have insulin receptors. So on the cell wall, insulin receptors. Inside of the cell, we have glucose transporters, and we're just going to keep it that simple. So insulin binds to these receptors in a healthy adult with proper metabolic function, or a healthy person. And then the insulin binds to glucose, and then the insulin signals to the glucose transporters inside of the cell to translocate, move from the inside of the cell, create a bridge to the outside of the cell so that we can bring glucose into the cell. Okay. So we're going to focus our spotlight on the insulin dependent uptake in the muscles, to some extent the liver, but basically the muscles and the fat tissue, the adipose. Okay. So within the liver, insulin promotes the conversion of glucose to glycogen, right? That's one of the stores for glycogen. Also triglycerides. So fats are formed and sometimes stored, unfortunately, in the liver cells. And at the same time, insulin inhibits the glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen. So we're not creating glycogen and breaking it down at the same time, because remember, the goal here is to take sugar out of the blood, not create it and put it back in. Same thing with gluconeogenesis. We're not creating new glucose just to put it back in, so that as well is inhibited. Now within the fat, or the adipose cells, it's pretty similar. It promotes glucose uptake, promotes the formation of triglycerides. Got to store that fat, convert the glucose to fat, store it, and it inhibits the breakdown of fat. So it inhibits lipolysis. Same idea. We're trying to take nutrients out of the bloodstream. And then when it comes to the muscle cell, it promotes that same thing, glucose uptake, formation of glycogen, inhibits the breakdown of glycogen, but it also promotes protein synthesis and inhibits the breakdown of protein. So there's a very obvious anabolic effect going on there, and something you wouldn't think of. You don't typically relate insulin to protein metabolism, but it is involved. Now, it's important to recognize that muscle absorbs roughly 80% of our blood glucose. So it is far and away our biggest sink of blood sugar. And just right now, just consider the implications on both the muscle storage capacity and the use specifically of glycogen, because both are affected by endurance training, and both are points of concern in sedentary individuals. And this is the first example of how indeed endurance athletes are a different class of human. So definitely not an apples to apples comparison.
This is, we mentioned something similar to this pretty regularly, than the fact that almost regardless of topic, when you're looking at it, the general recommendations that exist for average people many times are tailored toward the sedentary individual and not the endurance athlete. It's kind of a different approach. I'm sure you saw that too, just going throughout your schooling and everything else as well, Hannah. It's like two different camps that you deal with.
Yeah. And I think in this, it's important to note too, I think people hear fat and adipose tissue and they panic a little bit. But for those of us, which is probably everyone, if you're listening to this podcast, who's an athlete or an endurance athlete, you don't have to be worried about getting fat while you're riding, uptaking that glucose, which I think kind of goes back to the top of that question a little bit, is if you're riding and you're intaking this sugar water, you don't really have to worry about whatever's being stored in fat or storing in fat making you fat. So just to clarify, please don't worry about that while you're riding. You are definitely not taking in too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's super good advice, because boy, it's easy to get your head wrapped up into that. And then to do kind of like the advice that Amber is always warned against, don't diet on the bike, she said. But it's really easy to let our minds from a sedentary state, let our minds go over and trespass into that active state, and to guide us in bad directions when it should not even be there.
Especially as you're getting close to the end of a ride. I know a lot of people, it's like, okay, I only have 45 minutes left. I'm really hungry, but I can make it these last 45 minutes. Not
Good
worth
point.
it. Just eat something. It's for the best all around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry for the interjection there, Chad.
No,
carry on. Yeah.
Okay. So to sum it up, there are basically three goals of insulin secretion. First off is to increase glucose uptake, right? decrease the circulating glucose, basically the sugar in the blood, and then to increase stored energy. These are the three end games. So yes, blood sugar elevations largely dictate insulin secretion, and hence this is the concern around frequent spikes. So it's understandable that this is a concern, especially having someone in your circle of friends who's a diabetic and deals with this in a much realer nature. So the question kind of becomes, should blood sugar spikes be a concern for an endurance athlete? And the short answer, unfortunately, is yes, but with a big caveat. If you can't get the excess blood sugar out of your bloodstream, that's where the concern lies. And that is basically the crux of the matter here. We as endurance athletes typically don't have a problem clearing that blood sugar. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the matter of glucose transport. So glucose has to be actively transported into fat and muscle cells. I think it's passive transport into the liver. I'm not entirely sure. It doesn't matter. Active transport into the fat and muscles. So insulin signals to these glucose transporters that I mentioned earlier, and they undertake translocation, moving from the inside to the outside, creating a channel such that we can get sugar into the cell so that it can either pack it away or do some work. Now, in the case of fat and muscle, GLUT4 is the glucose transporter of choice. And it's not that there are a number of glucose transporters, there are sodium transporters, there are a lot of different ways to move these nutrients about. But when we talk about endurance performance, it's almost always about muscle action, and therefore it's going to be about GLUT4. So in fat cells, GLUT4 is necessary all the time. And this is important because if we don't clear the fats, then they're going to linger in the bloodstream. And that's a problem in and of itself, but also the muscles can be potentially undernourished and the stores understocked. Okay. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to muscle cells, though, and I think we have an animation to demonstrate this, glucose actually has a couple means of entry into the muscles. So there's GLUT4 insulin-dependent transport, but there's also a non-insulin dependent mechanism. Effectively, muscles have a back door, and this is exercise-induced GLUT4 translocation. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, but the important point here is that exercise enhances both the insulin-dependent and the non-insulin dependent means of translocation. Okay. Mm.
Yeah, and the visual that's showing on screen right now that y'all can see is blame me for any oversimplification that exists on this one, by the way, as I was providing direction.
Trying to convey a simple idea, though. It's perfect.
Yeah, to our artists here, but yeah, it shows that it's a totally different ball game, right, Chad? When you are in an active state versus sedentary state, whereas insulin is present and doing a job in that sedentary state. When you're active, it's not there. It's parking the bus.
If we're asking our muscles to use energy, we're really good at furnishing it. So all sorts of accommodations are made to help us do work.
Yeah. Whereas when we're in that that sedentary state, it is a different game, and insulin is taking care of the very job that it's been assigned. Right. So this should hopefully help you understand how different it is for endurance athletes taking in fuel when they're on the bike versus just taking in fuel as a sedentary individual and doing that. So very different cases.
Yep. Good point. Okay. So let me try to summarize glucose transport quite simply, just step you through the steps. So basically carbohydrate comes into the system, or glycogen is broken down and it makes it into the bloodstream. And this is what hyperglycemia is. So an elevation in blood sugar. The pancreas, what's the word I'm looking for? Releases insulin into the blood, and we get an expression of insulin receptors on the cells, right? The insulin then binds to these insulin receptors. The sugar binds to the insulin. The insulin tells the GLUT4 to translate to the outside of the cell. Contraction does this too. Glucose makes it into the cell stores or uses this glucose, and the insulin is degraded by the liver and the kidneys. Okay. So that's the whole process start to end. Now, the relevance here is that exercise increases both the concentration or the expression of GLUT4. And we must maintain insulin sensitivity in order to signal to these GLUT transporters, these glucose transporters. If we don't, we're getting no or at best limited nutrient entry into the cell, and the nutrients just remain in the bloodstream. So it's problematic on two sides there. So this accumulation can lead to resistance to the effects of insulin. And this brings us to the matter of insulin resistance, which really could be reduced to just the consequences of chronic hyperglycemia. So if your blood sugar stays elevated on a chronic basis, a routine, consistent basis, this is where the issues when the issues arise. So really simply defined, insulin resistance is basically when the liver, the muscles, the adipose simply don't respond appropriately to insulin. And this leads to circulating levels of blood sugars and blood fats that remain high, which leads to a myriad metabolic pathologies. And you mentioned type 2 diabetes, and this, of course, is one of the major concerns, but man, there are things as bad and arguably worse. So quickly, just to distinguish between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, type 1 is when there's a lack of insulin due to an autoimmune disorder. So basically the body doesn't recognize and therefore attacks the beta cells in the pancreas, and insulin production goes down, and can eventually quit entirely. And insulin has to be introduced into the system exogenously. It has to come from outside of the body. Whereas with type 2 diabetes, this is simply an overproduction of insulin. And this comes about for reasons that we'll discuss, but this causes the desensitization of the insulin receptors. And typically it's a result of energy surplus. Specifically, it's basically eating more carbohydrate than you use. And it's not as simple as that, but when we're comparing sedentary folk with endurance athletes, it can be as simple as that. And it's a vicious cycle. And anytime I think of this particular cycle, I'm reminded of the phrase, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink, right? Because through a combination of both genetic and environmental factors, and the environmental factors being, namely diet, exercise, and they typically say body weight, but let's call it what it is, body fat. We're not considered with being heavy, we're considered with being over fat. That leads to a decrease in insulin sensitivity. This leads to an increase in the production of insulin, and this increase in insulin production can lead to higher levels in sensitivity. Round and round we go, right? All the while, the pancreas is trying desperately to keep pace with demands placed on it by this chronically elevated blood glucose and blood lipids level. So put really simply, the nutrients can't get where they need to go. So one recommendation, just a bit of an aside here, is that if for whatever reason you are genetically predisposed, maybe because of family history, maybe because you've had blood work done before, maybe because you just recognize your intake of carbohydrates and low blood sugar crashes, et cetera, I highly recommend the involvement of a physician. It's just, if you're not already going down that path, go ahead and head down it right now. From the environmental perspective, there's so much within our control. So genetics kind of out of our hands. How we express our genetics, bit within our hands. Environmentally, very much within our hands. And namely, again, we're going back to diet, and this refers to both the quality of what you eat and the quantity. So excesses simply can't be forgiven if you're a sedentary person. And then the quality of the food, man, that can range very widely. Also exercise. And then really, if you take care of diet and exercise, body fat kind of follows suit. You really don't have to actively chase that if you're doing those other two things correctly. Now, those are the three big hitters, but also you have to consider chronic stress. So if you're under a continuous stress load and you don't manage that stress well, this can impact your insulin sensitivity. And sleep deprivation has a really big effect on it. And, you never really have to sweat that one night of bad sleep, but that one night of bad sleep can lead to people actually presenting with pre-diabetic blood glucose numbers. So this just shows you how big of an impact sleep can have on your blood glucose. Yeah. You do that perpetually or consistently or chronically, then over time, you can incur a certain level of insulin resistance.
This all just shows how important exercise is. Right? And how it's a necessary component of our existing, to have activity, our bodies are designed for it. It just seems to make very logical sense, particularly when you look at it in this light. Just does so many favorable things for us.
Completely does. And I'm reading Daniel Lieberman's new book called, I think it's Exercised, which basically counters everything you just said. I'm really struggling with it. It's an interesting perspective though, regardless.
One really quick thing, Chad, but this, I want to point this out because a lot of people might be listening to this and thinking oh my gosh, once again, remember sedentary versus active, very important thing to mention here. And then on top of this too, isn't this a great example of why we do these things? I know that somebody listening to this is going for, your main goal for the year is to set a new 40K TT PR or something, or you're going for some specific achievement within cycling, but in the end, look at how much good you're doing for your body, right? The health that you're maintaining, kind of going back to what you said last week, Chad, about being like a healthy individual first and a bike racer second, sort of a thing in terms of a good approach for us with our outlook on activity in general. This is another good reason to focus on that, to make yourself healthy first.
Yep.
You know?
Yeah. I think it could also be worth just super briefly in the simplest way possible, explaining a little bit of what your body has to go through if you don't give it that sugar, like having to go through finding energy through gluconeogenesis or something like that. Is that something that you're able to touch on just in a sentence or two?
I can say that if we effectively malnourish based on the level of activity that we're inflicting on ourselves or asking of ourselves, that the body has coping mechanisms. I mean, it'll find energy from different places, but eventually those places peter out. And when they do, the body starts getting pretty selective with what's necessary and what's not. It's like, okay, maybe I don't need my skin to be quite as soft or my hair to be quite as vibrant, or maybe I don't need to maintain the same internal temperature. Maybe I can live being a degree or two colder. All these things kind of are the sacrifices that you have to pay if you're not furnishing your body with enough nutrients to support what you're asking of it.
Not to mention the muscle breakdown that is likely going to be something that happens pretty readily, relatively speaking, on that sliding scale of.
It depends. Yeah, it depends where you're starting. Yep.
Yeah, no doubt. Which usually flies in the face of performance, right? Absolutely. Like you said, long-term, depending on how far you go down that road, absolutely flies in the face of health. It's complicated.
Yeah, you guys are teasing good points that we're going to get to.
Cool.
Okay, so
look at us.
That's good. Good conversation. Okay, so just a few more scary aspects of insulin resistance. First, it affects many different types of tissues, and we're going to limit this discussion, but muscle. If you have limited blood glucose entry, then you're going to get reduced stored energy, which is basically going to manifest as low energy, right? Reduced work capacity for us as athletes, and effectively undernourished muscles. When it comes to adipose tissue, we get desensitized to the effects of insulin, and that leads to higher serum triglyceride levels, or really fat levels. So higher fat in the blood. And I linked to an article there on how exercise actually alleviates lipid-induced insulin sensitivity, just as a bit of a hopeful aspect to everything that seems pretty negative, and is, but hang in there. Intramuscular triglyceride stores, so the fat that we actually store inside the muscle, is potentially harmful in sedentary individuals, but it actually is a boon for endurance athletes. And this is something that's termed the athlete's paradox. And I linked to, I think, a revisit of the athlete's paradox. But basically, I think it just boils down to the fact is we use them, and we thereby maintain their utility. It's the whole use it or lose it idea. Fat in the cells when we're not, or in the muscle cells or any cells when we're not using it, not a good thing. But if we're utilizing it, it's an energy resource. And then brain, I'm going to touch on it just ever so briefly, but when you have compromised glucose uptake in the brain, you effectively have malnourished neurons, right? Malnourished brain cells. And this has been repeatedly scientifically linked to numerous mental disorders, some of the scariest ones. Then, this will get brighter, I promise. There's one major threat, another major threat of insulin resistance is that it can pave the way for metabolic syndrome. And undoubtedly, you've heard this before, but it plays its part in helping you fulfill a certain number of criteria. Check so many boxes, and you qualify for that distinguished description. You have too big a waistline, and that ties back to visceral fat, really. Blood pressure, I'll touch on that in just a second. Elevated blood triglycerides or blood fats, just talked about that. Low HDL. So if you don't have those high density lipoproteins floating around, you can't really suck up cholesterol out of the bloodstream as well as you might. And then fasting blood glucose, which is what we're talking about here. And I'll use this as an example of how you would check that box in the case of metabolic syndrome. So if you have chronically elevated fasting blood glucose, and typically this is measured via HbA1c, and I know that measure has come under a bit of criticism, but man, it's so widely used. I have to believe there's something to it because it's oh so relied upon. But this can give you an insight into your current level of insulin insensitivity. And all it is, it's a measure of glycated hemoglobin. So we know hemoglobin is the protein on our blood cells that binds oxygen, delivers it to the cells. Well, this hemoglobin can actually get glycated, which is basically sugar coated. and they can measure that level of sugar coating, and they can tell you not what your blood sugar is in the moment, but what your blood sugar has been over the past 80, 90, 100 days, because that's roughly the life of a red blood cell. So if this fasting blood glucose measure, this average measure over so many days falls in the ballpark of 100 to 125, and that's, excuse me, milligrams per deciliter. So milligrams of glucose in a deciliter of blood, or if you're measuring millimoles per liter, it'd be 5.6 to 6.9. But if you're in that bracket, you are designated or classified as pre-diabetic. If I'm just a little above that, so now you're 126 milligrams per deciliter or 7.0 millimoles per liter, then you're classified as diabetic. So, how do we combat this? Simply maintain your insulin sensitivity via, again, exercise, diet, weight management, stress control or stress management, and sleep, proper sleep.
Chad, stress management, this one just keeps like ringing an alarm bell for me. And I kind of wanted to talk about how each of us manage stress. And we don't have to but yeah, how do we, each one of us, Hannah, what do you do when you feel stress accumulating? How do you manage that personally for you?
Yeah, I think that's a super relevant question this year. And I think something that this year being this COVID year, which is now more than a year, I think for me, the biggest lesson that I've learned is it's constantly changing, and that's okay. What served you at one point for stress management might not serve you at another point for stress management. And so for me, I've actually been really listening to what my brain and my body is telling me with that stress. Historically, it's like, okay, I feel stressed, therefore I'm going to X, Y, or Z. Now I'm like, oh, okay, I feel stress. What is my body asking for in this stress? Is it to deload something? Is it to answer the question? Is it to find a way to actually ignore it for the time being? And then kind of the answer to those questions lead me down different paths. It might be journaling, it might be research, it might be, going to sleep early. And so I think for me, it's really been listening to which path I need to go down to acknowledge that stress and say, hey, I'm stressed. It's okay. Everybody's stressed. Now we will do about that.
Mm. How about you, Chad? What you've had a really stressful year, in particular, the past year of moving and big changes and loss. And how have you managed?
Hannah brought up a lot of really good specific points. Everything I completely agree with. If I look at it from a more general perspective, it's basically been what I've been trying to do over the last, I'd say series of years, but now series of decades, which is just build myself into a lifestyle that suits me, avoiding and building out those things that don't work for me and steering myself in as many ways as possible toward the things that work for me, such that I find myself in a position that anytime I'm in a hard position or a hard place, I can just look at all the good things I have going for me. I mean, I just focus on the positive, to put it simply. But when you create all sorts of positives around you, it becomes increasingly easy to do just that.
That's a really good zoomed out view. I'm not sure I really have anything productive to add to this. I think I struggle with managing stress. I tend to, when I have a source of stress, I just think I want to directly address and solve that and remove it. But in many cases, I simply can't. Right. So then that persists. And then I'm the sort of person that really struggles with feeling like I'm shirking responsibility. If I'm like, well, you can't solve it right now. You need to focus on something else, or maybe you need to actually give yourself some time, because I'm particularly hard on myself. Right. So I'll think, why the heck are you out enjoying riding your bike when you could take care of this bigger problem?
And that's kind of what I'm getting at, though, that because you're describing that myopic view where you just get so focused on that one thing, where if you can just distract your focus from that one thing to all the other good things, it kind of resolves itself, or at least diminishes in importance.
I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks back that it talked about stress and anxiety. And it said that it's very difficult for the brain to experience awe and anxiety at the same time. And so I think that's kind of what we're talking about, is if you can be in awe or be in gratitude of something, it's difficult for your brain to also hang on to whatever the stress is. So exactly that, whether it's being in awe of what your body can do, being in awe of the mountains around you, whatever it is, I think that's a super, it's a very real way to handle it. It's great.
Yeah. And I know I'm probably not alone in this, but I'm certainly guilty of making something a bigger deal than it needs to be, right? In the sense that I'll recognize that point of, or that source of stress, but then create it or make it much larger than it needs to be. That's a great point, is to find that. It's great points, y'all. And sorry once again to interrupt, Chad, but hopefully that was a helpful thing, because the training part, I think we all know how to activate that lever, right? Like the training part makes sense. We've talked so much for years now, and we will continue to talk about a proper nourishment, right? And making sure that you're giving your body what it needs in that regard. So the stress point I just wanted to cover. Appreciate you taking the time for that, Chad. Thank you.
That's a good tangent. I liked it.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to close out all the negatives of insulin resistance, last thing, let's just touch on endothelial or basically vascular dysfunction. So when our blood vessels aren't up to the task, and this has to do with cardiovascular disease and what I just mentioned, hypertension. So that high blood pressure comes about because, really simply, our blood vessels just don't wear well when they're under the weight of these effects of accumulation. All these things that shouldn't be in the bloodstream stay in the bloodstream. Bad stuff happens. Point is, exercise. Why? Because for no other reason than the benefit to increase vascular health. I mean, if you need just one reason, how about that one? Okay, so we've talked about the consequences of chronically high fasting blood glucose levels, right? A lot of sugar in the blood, fats in the blood. Now let's talk about the consequences, or really the benefits of exercise. So the single most commonly recommended course of action in the face of metabolic disorders, ask any physician, they're going to steer you to exercise. It's the easy get, but it also basically covers a lot of bases. And there's no shortage of studies on the exercise benefits for type 2 diabetics, since this was mentioned earlier. I looked at 5 studies in particular and a meta-analysis and review. And the point simply is that if exercise improves insulin sensitivity in type 2 diabetics, well, what's it going to do for people who are less metabolically deranged or in a better, more healthful state? So some studies, more encouraging matters on what is really an easy topic to support in the literature, because it just is of particular interest to us as endurance athletes. Is going to be one study that looked at the benefits of high intensity interval training and sprint intensity training. And it showed that these are widely favored, but not unanimously. A 2020 study also pointed out, and they looked at obese adults, but moderate intensity continuous training versus the high intensity interval training that we're so accustomed to had the same effects on insulin sensitivity. And then also the moderate intensity in healthy subjects, positive effect on insulin sensitivity. Another study looked at just exercise snacks, is how they termed it, but just little bits of exercise throughout the day. Again, really positive effects on sensitivity to insulin. Another study looked at insulin sensitivity effects on a single bout of exercise and how they persist anywhere from 2 hours to more than 72 hours post. So these aren't just short-term effects, they can really carry. Insulin sensitivity can respond really quickly to exercise. And I linked to a study on that particular matter where they looked at athletes. They might've been untrained, trained, I don't remember, but people following 10 days, well, they were trained, 10 days of detraining, and they did a single bout of exercise and it restored their insulin and glucose responses to the trained level. So where they were 10 days prior, stopped training for those entire 10 days, did one bout of exercise, right back on track. So it's very responsive. Reduced visceral fat led to an increase in insulin sensitivity. So news to no one, visceral fat's not good for you. Get the weight off your belly. Another study, increased VO2 max has a positive correlation with insulin sensitivity. But other studies showed that there are a lot of ways to increase your insulin sensitivity without affecting your aerobic capacity. So you don't have to chase improvements in insulin sensitivity via improvements in VO2 max. Exercise, yeah, I still believe that's part and parcel, but it doesn't have to mean you elevate the playing field.
Were these studies done on athletes or sedentary individuals? I'm sorry, I might have missed that.
is a mixed bag. So, and I link to all of these. I mean, it goes from everywhere from untrained to obese to type 2 diabetics to, I don't think I did any highly trained, but there were definitely trained athletes in there.
Mm-hmm. When I was in college, I had to spend some time working with a physician. And when people with metabolic disorder would come in, she would obviously recommend exercise. And what she classified exercise as was 10 minutes or more with a heart rate over 100 was her general definition of exercise. And I just felt like it was relevant for this, because anyone listening to the podcast, if someone said exercise and that was the definition, we'd all probably be like, wow, I can do that. That's pretty easy. So it's just interesting. It's all relative.
It is. It is. And that, basically points to the fact that it is in fact subjective, and where you're starting from definitely reduces the demands. I mean, we do something like that, it's going to have no impact on anything. We're so accustomed to it, so adapted to it. But someone who comes in who is sedentary, who the idea of, exercise might as well be a 4-letter word. They are going to hear things differently. They need to be baby stepped into the process. They need something that introduces them to the positive possibilities of just doing a little bit of work.
And that's not to say too, Chad, that, so you even shared there about the athletes, following 10 days of detraining, they can have changes in their insulin sensitivity levels, but it also doesn't take long for them to get back to that as well.
Sure.
So I don't want to instill a fear in anybody where you feel like I can't take time off the bike because I'm going to, and it's nothing that dramatic at all.
Not at all. But if you are taking time off the bike, you obviously don't need to follow the same diet. You're not going to be jamming carbohydrate bars and sugar water and gel blocks and all those things into your system sitting on the couch.
Yeah, I don't casually drink sugar water.
Most of us don't. Most of us don't, but I have a point coming up.
Then again, what is a soda?
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's what soda is. But I don't like thinking about that. Once again, because I think that athletes will have to have, all of us listening to this, will have to have this repeated to us constantly, many times in our heads here as we listen to this, sedentary versus normal, and think about the separations that exist. You wouldn't casually sit on your couch and just eat gels and your high carb mix, right? Like that's probably not what these athletes are doing. So yeah, just keep that in mind. The separations.
You beat me to a point that I'm very eager to make. Let me close this out and say, another benefit of exercise is increased muscle capillarization. So just increased blood flow to the muscles. This too has been demonstrated to have an improved muscle or improved impact on muscle insulin sensitivity. The point is that exercise can impact your insulin sensitivity in many favorable ways. So exercise. Okay. Now with all this in mind, basically what we're just talking about, exercise is not a free pass to eat anything without compunction. You do have to consider the duration of your exercise. I mean, we think I worked out today, I can eat whatever I want. Well, you did, but how long did you work out? How much work did you actually do? Maybe you did 1 or 2 hours, but the other 22 hours, there's a lot going on in those 22 hours. There's a lot of damage that you can do, a lot of hard work that you can undo. So do consider that relativity. Consider the frequency too. How many days a week are you working out, or maybe even times a day? This does grant you a bit of a pass on some days, but those other days, obviously you're going to have to modify your eating habits to some degree. And then the big one is intensity. This is the one that I always land on, because you hear people like Hannah just described, explained, they describe exercise very differently. So if you go out for a brisk or maybe even a leisurely lunch hour walk, or you hop on the bike and you do some VO2 max intervals, distinct differences, right? You ask yourself, what fibers am I tapping? Am I even decrementing those fibers' glycogen stores? What sort of force am I putting out? Because type 1 fibers store less, spend less. So if that's all you're taxing, well, you obviously are going to nourish differently. Low intensity work can and should be predominantly fat fueled, but insulin inhibits lipolysis. We talked about that earlier. We've talked about that 100 times. So hold off on the sugar water or the gel blocks if all you're doing is going for a couple walks around the block over your lunch hour. So do consider intensity.
This is Chad. Can I share just a couple things that have helped me with nourishment in this regard here? Because I've always had a very complicated relationship with food, and trying to navigate that and nourishment has been like really tough. And when you like, I felt like if I trained, then I earned something from on the food side. And I had that relationship for quite some time. And it's pretty damaging and difficult and emotionally hard, because you get into these constant swings where you feel like, did I earn something now? No, I didn't. Did I earn something today? Yes, I did. And then I overindulged. Then I feel bad about it. It's hard. We did a fantastic podcast on the Successful Athletes podcast episode with James Dunleap. I mentioned it last week, where he talked about his management of binge eating disorder and still maintaining, the lifestyle of an endurance athlete and how he managed that. And the biggest thing that's helped me with all of that is focusing on quality and just making sure that I'm giving my body quality nutrients, a variety of nutrients. And if I make that my focus, and I think of when I'm eating, instead of thinking of it as a necessary task or something that I need to take this in so then I can do this, or because I did something active, I can do this. Instead of thinking it that way, I just think of, how can I give my body more good stuff? Mm-hmm. And when I think of it that way, it's pretty hard for me to fuel poorly, in the sense that, like, I'm fueling with vegetables and fruits, but doing so in moderation, because boy, it's really hard to eat, a gigantic bowl full of vegetables. You'll feel amazingly full after you eat something like that. It's pretty tough. So I've found that just focusing on quality and making sure and giving my body what it needs is a really good way to be able to manage that. Because like you said, Chad, it can get really tough if you exercise and then you have this relationship where you're like, I exercise or I ride regularly, therefore I can eat whatever I want. And whenever I want, and do all that. And I don't want somebody to develop a complex around that. Right. So perhaps just shifting your focus to giving your body the highest quality that it can get. Can be I would pose that as a healthier alternative for people to be able to make decisions that you don't feel bad about later on or beforehand with nutrition. So.
Yep. And I completely agree. And this is a perfect segue into the take homes. So let's close this out with some actionable items here. First off, and just some information that you need to be information that you need to be reminded of. Because that was a heck of a lot of information. So first off, insulin spikes aren't harmful if you're sensitive to the effects of insulin. Okay, that's basically true, right? If you're using the sugar, your insulin sensitivity is high. Everything works as it's supposed to work. The magnitude of the impact on your insulin sensitivity definitely depends on your basal state. So if you're coming into this whole process healthy versus someone who's overweight or obese, if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, obviously it's going to be a different road for you. High blood sugar becomes a concern when it's chronically elevated. So these acute changes, or the spikes that you term them, Seamus, are it's normal blood sugar insulin response. Okay. Mm-hmm. Sustained elevation, however, or slow returns to baseline, these can be problematic. These could be causes for concern. And then point 4, emphasize the environmental aspects of good metabolic health, namely exercise and diet and the weight control that we've talked about numerous times already. And when you hear metabolic health, don't just reduce it to, metabolic health, that only applies to athletes. No, metabolic health, we're talking about the health of your cells. Cells make up your entire body. So we're talking about health in a general sense. But all of this, to really put it another way, just Seamus, keep doing the things you're probably already doing as an endurance athlete. You're on the right path. And personally, with regards to insulin resistance, I say target exercise above all, because so often exercise is the best medicine, but here it actually drives the other highly controllable factors. As Jonathan just mentioned, high quality foods become part of the picture. They become increasingly necessary as you ask more and more of yourself in terms of performance. And then weight control is more easily achieved when you couple an appropriate diet with proper exercise. It just kind of happens. So man, start with exercise. And then finally, with regards to insulin sensitivity regarding exercise, don't overthink the dose. Just do something and do it often.
Yeah, great advice, Chad. Hannah, do you have any, we're going to talk about meal timing in the next one and kind of taking a lot of this information and giving it a lot of application, but do you have anything else that you would want to add before we move on to Brittany's question?
I think Chad did a great job.
Cool.
I don't have a lot to add now.
Awesome. Thanks for diving down that, Chad. I know that also has a lot of personal relevance for you as well. So I appreciate you going through that to help our audience. Yeah, absolutely. If you have questions about this, I see a lot of you on YouTube right now in the live chat, which you can join us, by the way, every Thursday, 8 a.m. Pacific is usually when we're live, as we are this time. And you can join the live chat and chat with lots of folks on there. And lots of people are finding this insight very helpful. So Seamus, thank you for asking the question that you were afraid to ask, because a lot of people had the same question. Chad learned throughout this even, and I'm sure everybody across the whole spectrum has learned throughout this. And then also a lot of people talking about the tips that they've found to be able to manage their health, which is their relationship with nutrition and everything else, which is fantastic.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.